Thank you for joining me as we continue our journey to developing a theory and strategy for cultivating healthy marriages and families in the world today. So far this season, we've explored the realms of psychology, sociology, economics, and competing narratives of human history, particularly focusing on the Age of Enlightenment, which dominated the 17th and 18th centuries. The ideas of science, humanism, and progress that began during the Age of Enlightenment continue to shape the way we think and live today. In this episode, I'm joined by Scientific Skeptic, who has dedicated himself for over a decade to educating the public in science and philosophy literacy, to use their critical thinking skills to tell good from bad information and to evaluate truth claims. Our discussion today begins with me inviting Scientific Skeptic to evaluate the 4 philosophical premises with which I began Season 2 back in Episode 0. Our discussion includes consideration of how fields like evolutionary biology and philosophers like David Hume and Sam Harris may shed light on what, if anything, we can derive from the realm of science as we determine what is good and bad, desirable and undesirable, in how we approach marriages and families today.
Welcome. I'm so glad you could join us. Please come in. Your presence honors us. Here at the Mr. Homemaker podcast, we share our stories and challenges, collect the best expert advice, and offer one another support as we learn to manage our households. Your perspective and contributions will be very valuable. And just in time, today's discussion is about to begin. It is my pleasure to present Mr. Homemaker.
Scientific skepticism is a framework, a philosophical foundation, if you want. I find it very useful. I mean, I don't like labels, but I find it to be the most useful label I've found to affiliate with. Obviously, I could add, philosophical realist and methodological naturalist, and a whole host of other schools of philosophy. So I can only speak for myself, my opinions. There are certain people that I have been inspired by that I consider good representatives of this school of thought, and hopefully I do it justice. But simply, it's not enough to say you're a science advocate or you're a scientific skeptic. You need to have the chops. You need to be able to know what you're talking about. I simplify my philosophy down to 3 primary philosophical domains of inquiry. So, ontology, what exists in the nature of these things that exist, and essentially also what is unlikely to exist. Mm-hmm. Epistemology, which is a conversation about knowledge. Essentially, does knowledge exist? Can we acquire it? What are the limits of knowledge? How much confidence can we have in knowledge claims? And what are the methods? What are the most dependable methods to go about trying to acquire it? And then axiology. And axiology is essentially a conversation about how a universe could or should be. And so then we're in the realm of moral philosophy, ethics, values, mores, things like that. So that would be my
those are
trichotomy,
your 3 categories of philosophy.
My 3 pillars. And I think that pretty much allows us then to pretty much sort of discuss a whole lot of stuff.
Okay, so let's segue into here's how before I knew that I was going to have this be having this conversation, I knew even as I embarked on season 2 of we're going to transition from this documentary to this more like philosophical discussion, exploration of what can we know about what makes for a good marriage and family and upbringing for children. Like, what can we know?
Whole epistemology stuff.
So I knew that I had to scope that. And so in my episode 0, my launch of this season back in August or first week of September, here I identified 4 principles, and I'm going to run through them really quickly, and then I'm going to go back, and for each of them, I really want to genuinely, I want to substantively, you give me your reaction to, like, yeah, from the scientific skeptic paradigm, that is sound, or like, yeah, I don't think you have any basis for this assumption.
That was rubbish, Marcus. Come on.
It's total garbage. All right, so here are my 4. First, run through quick, real brief. Okay, so 1 is objectivism, which is that I assume that reality and truth exist objectively. Item 1. Item 2, human nature, that all human beings share a core or foundational nature. Item 3, human flourishing, that because there is an objective reality and because there is a human nature, what is good for us and what goods we should pursue are things we can discover.
What was the word? Number 3?
Human flourishing, or
eudaimonia.
Eudaimonia, exactly. Yes, the word I never pronounce right, which is why I always say human flourishing.
Okay.
And then my 4th assumption, as I embarked on season 2, was, and this one's like definitely the most tenuous. I think these kind of go from like most foundational to most tenuous, is structuralism, which is the sociological and anthropological school of thought that says institutions are most meaningfully understood in their relationship to other institutions and the individual, and that you have to understand the function that they serve in the system in order to evaluate whether a given institution, like marriage, like family, is it healthy? Is it serving its function? You need to understand what is it trying to achieve and how does it do that in relation to other institutions within society. Okay, so those were the 4 real quick.
What I love about already your approach is that we had talked about, we both are on the same page in terms of, in order to have a healthy conversation, you have to agree on first principles. Right. You're starting out trying to see where we have agreement on your understanding of first principles. I would probably have some different principles, but this is about your effort to synthesize and have a conversation. I really appreciate that ultimately we're going to begin with the fundamentals, because I really do believe that you can't have a productive conversation about anything unless you have this fundamental conversation.
Objectivism, reality and truth exist objectively as an ontological matter, as a matter of what exists. I am asserting, or I'm assuming, there is an objective reality that exists independently of our perceptions and feelings. And
indeed. So in that context, then, I call myself a philosophical realist, and I describe myself as a philosophical realist on all those 3 domains. So I'm an ontological realist, I'm an epistemological realist, and I am a axiological realist.
So my second premise was that human nature exists objectively, and that the diversity we see between cultures and between individuals, those are variations that are built upon a shared foundation. But I would disagree with somebody who says, no, like somebody across the ocean from me, we don't share a human nature. They're a different kind of entity. And I would say, no, we're all human, and we all share a core human identity and nature. And the diversity between us is more likely to be superficial than fundamental to our nature.
Agreed.
So wax poetic about that a little bit.
So to respond to that, as a philosophical realist, believing in an objective reality out there, I indeed agree that there is a thing called human nature. We share as humans, has even biology, at writ large, but particular to our species, we have a thing called human nature, and it exists on a spectrum of possible permutations, possible with distinction, with unique, interesting differences. But
how would you even go about identifying sort of, here are the things from like the most foundational, the most the most central to universal human nature to like work your way out? Like, how would you go about that? I sort of have some initial thoughts, but
No,
I'd
it's, I
love to
mean,
hear yours.
it's obviously a good question, obviously a
Yeah,
broad question, but you're likely going to turn to a domain of inquiry like evolutionary biology.
that's exactly.
A
Yeah,
domain that I'm very fond of, and that I've certainly spent decades trying to better understand. So, there's certain things we can say about Homo sapiens sapien. We're a social animal.
right,
We are built. We are an intelligent animal, but unfortunately, intelligence is probably built not um, primarily for a concern for the truth, but how to propagate our genes and survive.
hmm,
And
hmm,
so in the words of Richard Dawkins, essentially the quintessential voice on evolutionary biology, the gene is the unit of evolution, and we are essentially just a vessel of a whole bunch of genes, um, if I can anthropomorphize, that want to get ahead
right,
in the universe. They want to replicate and propagate themselves in this universe. And we are a complex biological vessel that attempts to fulfill that desire, for lack of a better term. So when we're talking about human nature, we are a very complex biological organism with a
right,
lot of possible behavioral possibilities constrained by the laws of physics. We are driven by a need to survive, to reproduce, to gain social status, and to
right,
succeed in a social community alongside other social animals. We compete against other social animals and other animals, and
sure.
it's a sort of galactic, well, at least a terrestrial um, gene fight. It's all
So,
about which genes win, which species survives, and which species and gene set is best equipped to deal with anything that the universe will throw at it.
all right, the third one is human flourishing. Okay, if we believe there's an objective reality exists out there independent of our perception and our feelings, and that includes an objective thing, ontologically, there is something in existence called human nature. If those two things are true, then I think they lead you to a conclusion that there's something called human flourishing or eudaimonia.
He nailed
Yes.
it. He
Yes.
nailed it.
Okay. So, which is the Greek, like that was Plato or Aristotle coined the term, I guess, or at least made it famous. But the idea is, given those preceding two items, what is good for us? What enriches us? What cultivates our well-being as human beings is something that we can discover.
Indeed.
And the goods that we can pursue or should pursue, the things that are worth our pursuit, those are also things that we can discover them. This is a worthwhile venture, and we can discover this venture is less worthwhile, or maybe
Indeed.
even counterproductive. It is maybe even harmful to our well-being to undertake certain efforts. And then this is where I get a lot of pushback as I engage with people. Is I'll say like, so you don't get to, like, your free will is not so that you can invent or decide this is what is good. This is what is good for me or good for society. You don't get to pick that. It exists objectively, and we can all triangulate on it, and we can be, some people are more right and some people are more or less right. Even if we're all trying to get the right answer, there is some objective answer about whether or not something is good or bad. Now, to steal, because again, think something I would not have thought about prior to discovering Scientific Skeptic and your channel, and I've watched hours of Sam Harris. Is that his name? And he talks about a landscape of human flourishing, where it's not a matter of there's only one right answer. It's not a matter of every person should be trying to pursue the same goods in the same way for the same reasons. He would say there might be many different ways to achieve human flourishing, but there's a lot more ways to mess it up. And I think I agree with Sam Harris on that.
So David Hume, arguably the most modern of skeptics, in as a precursor and a a member of the early Enlightenment project, suggested that you can't derive an ought from an is.
Right.
So he believed in an objective world out there,
Right.
the ontology stuff,
Right.
but he argued that we can't derive any moral conclusions, objectively speaking, from the facts of the universe, and that essentially morality is subjective. All that you need to concede with me is that there are at least better moral answers and worse moral answers.
Interesting.
So if you don't want to take the strong form,
yeah,
at least let's talk about, and the example I always use is, if you think that a civilization which allows gratuitous murder and doesn't sanction murder is going to be just as healthy and successful as a civilization which does not promote the value of gratuitous murder and sanctions gratuitous murder, then in the words of Sam Harris, I don't think you know what you're talking about. I don't understand what you're talking about, and I'm pretty sure that you don't either. The fact that people don't agree on moral conclusions doesn't mean that it's not a thing that exists out there in terms of how to objectively discuss how to create flourishing societies as opposed to failed societies, and how there are likely better ways to get there. So in the Sam Harris landscape metaphor, there are better ways to accomplish more human flourishing and worse ways to accomplish human flourishing. And all that you need to concede to me to get there is that we could all imagine a society that would be a nightmare, that nobody would want to live in, and that would lead to horrific outcomes. So eudaimonia. So when we're talking about, then now we're firmly in the realm of axiology. We're talking about how a universe should be, how a universe could be, how we can construct as agents in this universe with agency, who can actually impact upon the world, constrained by the laws of physics. How can we attempt to create civilizations, societies, cultures, norms, ethics that are at achieving our aims? Hume's position, which is why it has become essentially a sort of dogmatism, that you cannot derive an ought or a should from an is. So you can describe how the universe is through science, but you can't bring to bear that massive body of evidence to say how we should be, how we could be, what we should do to be able to improve our opportunities to be happy or to achieve fulfillment, or dare I say self-enlightenment. And this is where
self-actualization, I think, is Maslow's
self-actualization, to use Maslow's term. So this is where we find common ground again, Mr. Homemaker and I, that we both disagree with this claim. We are a function, we exist, right? So, Descartes just came up with the very clever and now viral Latin expression of cogito ergo sum. He questioned, what can we know about this, the thing that I find myself in, existence? And he said, I think. Therefore, if I think, I must be a thing in this universe. I must exist for thinking to even be something that could occur. And so he essentially asserts that the only thing I can be certain of is that I actually indeed exist. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. And he attempts to then, that's the only thing he essentially can be comfortable with asserting with any confidence, is that at least he is. Well, what is he? So now we're talking about, what is the thing that can think? Well, it's a product of the universe. It emerges from the laws of physics. It's constrained by the laws of physics. And then we have an area of domain that we refer to as evolution. And what can we say about evolution? If you believe in that sort of ridiculous thing that's backed by a massive amount of evidence, and I forget who the person said it was, but he said essentially that everything is meaningless absent evolution as a foundational premise. So if you don't accept evolution, then pretty much you might as well throw away everything we know about biology, because it's a foundational premise, axiom, a belief. And so in that context, then, so what are we? If Descartes says, I think, therefore I am, he is. So what is he? Ontologically speaking, what is the thing that just said, I think, therefore I am? He's a human being. He's a Homo sapiens sapien. He's an animal. He's an organism which finds itself on this planet, which we call Earth. And if you disagree with those things, we have to begin there. But if you don't disagree with those things, then we can have a conversation about what sort of animal is this. Well, this is an animal that is built by the universe to try to survive, and has a set of skills, essentially to promote that end, which is to survive, to procreate and to survive, to find nutrients, to find viable mates, to avoid pain and suffering. So given what we know about the thing that we are, we can say certain things about how to get to survive in this world. So because we're built to want to avoid pain and suffering and to survive, we can talk about strategies that might be better or worse at how to survive, minimize pain, and optimize living, the experience of living. Or where I differ from Sam Harris, and I'm not exactly sure why he's not grounded his moral realism in biology. And I don't know. I mean, from this, I've always been confused as to why he doesn't attempt to ground it in just our biological directive to try to survive. So we're having a conversation about strategies in this universe, constrained by the laws of physics, to better improve your odds of survival. It's to be my position. I've not found other moral philosophers grounding moral realism in biology. And I don't know why. And I don't know why that's because they feel constrained because they're talking philosophy. I don't know. I mean, how can you not appeal to science, which is a conversation about how the world really is, or at least the best understanding we have?
So we did Objectivism, human nature, human flourishing, or Eudaimonia. So my fourth thing, I expect, and I don't want you to pull any punches. I want you to really put me through the ringer on this one. But structuralism, or sometimes I'm being imprecise, but functional structuralism or structural functionalism is, as I've captured it from Wikipedia, the position that when evaluating the health or dysfunction of a given human institution, such as marriage or family, that you can only evaluate it effectively or meaningfully if you are looking at it in its context, its relationship to other institutions. If you want to know whether or not you have a healthy, this is not me talking, editorializing. If you want to know, as I do I have a healthy marriage? What would a healthy marriage look like? I have to consider, how is my marriage impacting my family, right? So like my children, my in-laws, my parents, right? Like, is my marriage contributing to their flourishing, or is it detracting from it? Because if it's detracting from it, then my marriage isn't healthy, even if selfishly I'm like, oh no, it's serving my needs, but it's not actually serving broader needs. For example, I'm just spinning out an example, but you have to think about a given institution in its context. So that's one sub bullet of structuralism.
So if I understand, essentially asking the question, is there a sort of inherent value with any institution? So it's essentially questioning whether or not an institution has
I'd say it's almost rejecting the opposite position would be, there is no human institution, there's no individual, and there's no institution that is an island unto itself, and that there's no self-licking ice cream cone. You can't say like, yep, it's meeting its own needs. Like, well, that's not a valid paradigm. You have to look at it in context.
So you don't respect it just because it exists. It needs to demonstrate its value in some way.
See, you're saying it better than me. Yet again,
the question about the ontology, because now we get into things like constructionism, and whether or not anything that a human constructs has any meaning. So now you're again having the conversation about realism versus relativism, and how you can suggest that anything that a human has constructed has any meaning or relevance or objectivity or an inherent value in the universe. Now you're back to Hume.
Right.
The way that I would describe Hume is the way that, for example, Aristotle, Plato, Spinoza, and a whole host of historical philosophers and scientists across the ages. These are my intellectual heroes. You know, to quote Newton, we stand on the shoulders of giants. But that's a very different conversation than saying that I think they're right. They were influential. They changed the way that we had conversations. They brought new elements to conversations that were novel and that have influenced other thinkers. But I tend to be a modernist in the sense that I believe that knowledge is mostly additive. And we can have a conversation about that, because
I think so.
We might have a conversation about, is it possible that we lost some wisdom, not a word I'm fond of, but is it possible?
Whereas that's the word I love. So this is going to be a point of difference for us when we get to wisdom.
That depending upon how you want to define it, I might love it. But
I'm going to figure out how to define it in a way that I know you'll dislike, so we can have a good argument about it.
So we can have a good disagreement. Hume was hugely important, historically speaking, in terms of a modern, more secular understanding of critical thinking and skepticism, in a way that was no longer mired in supernatural wish thinking, and facts derived from authority and metaphysics and stuff like that. So Hume was a good thinker for his time, very inspirational, but that doesn't mean that he was right. It doesn't mean that you want to be a Humean in the modern context. It just means that, so an example is Aristotle. Aristotle, arguably the first scientist. Aristotle is wrong about pretty much everything, because Aristotle was not privy to the facts that we have today. So Aristotle, for his time, was way ahead of his time. But you don't want to refer to Aristotle, I don't think, on good, sound moral reasoning, on good, solid science in the 21st century.
I'm not going to cite Aristotle in my biology paper, right?
Correct.
Yeah. Perfect.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that we haven't really gotten to is structuralism.
Yeah. So, and I'm going to agree with your recharacterization of my first sub-bullet, which is no human institution has intrinsic standalone value. Everything should be evaluated in its context. Nobody is an island. No institution is an island. I'm adopting this position.
And I would just say that, as with every human idea, we should always be challenging it in terms of, in the words of, this is science as opposed to philosophy, but so I do, again, as a realist, I believe we can have a conversation about whether or not something works. And that's true of governance models, economic models, the social models, moral systems, and any other institution or structure that is imagined by humans. If it works, let's stick with it. If we think it doesn't work, or it doesn't work well enough, we challenge it, we reform it, we throw it away, we replace it, whatever. But again, we're back to, these are truth claims about how, and again, back to moral realism. These are truth claims about strategies of, the human species has all been a set of trial and error experiments, and we are working on it. We're trying to improve upon models which allow for more people more of the time. If you're a utilitarian, if you're a humanist, you care about more people more of the time experiencing, more eudaimonia, less suffering. So again, and this is a moral premise, and it's an axiom, and we haven't really discussed, again, we touched on it there, but when we're talking about moral realism or science, we're talking about agreeing on certain axioms. And this is where we get into the moral relativists saying you can't ground that axiom in the universe. So, for example, science. Science has a set of axioms, a set of beliefs, if you want to use the more sketchy word. We believe.
I do want to get into that's our next segment. Let's talk about some sketchy words.
We believe in the value of evidence. We believe in the value.
We scientific skeptics.
We scientific skeptics value evidence, empirical evidence. We value employing a methodology of to go about the exercise of trying to figure out how the universe works, and we use a particular epistemology, a particular methodology which takes into account the fact that we are biased, imperfect human beings with biases. That's why we value employing a method. That's why, and as a methodological naturalist, we favor science and we favor a method, and we recognize that evidence is something we should care about, something we should value. And if you don't care about those things, you're going to be more likely to believe in alternative ways of knowing, or if you're a true relativist, you don't believe that we can know at all.
So if you believe in objective reality, then I'm going to say something scandalous. You must believe in objective truth. People can say, that's true. I know that that is true because I believe in objective reality, and I believe this matches objective reality. It is a truth.
I don't believe that truth or proof are scientific words. You're talking about deductive logic. You're not talking about science. You're talking about deductive reasoning.
Okay.
Science is not in the field of deductive logic. It is in the field of inductive reasoning. We collect data and we try to extrapolate.
And you're saying that is one of the key distinctions between philosophy and science, is that science doesn't play philosophy's game of moving the opposite direction. It only
philosophy doesn't have the benefit of the opposite.
Yeah, either way. Yeah.
Philosophy doesn't have the benefit of having the evidence. It doesn't have the empiricism. So the way that I always describe philosophy, I mean, good modern philosophy should take into consideration our knowledge, the things that we can claim to know about the world based on science and deductive reasoning. But the way that I always describe, I describe science as an epistemology. So it's a philosophical domain. So it's a way of going about trying to figure out how the world is, how to figure out what we can claim to know about the universe. And philosophy is the interpretation of what we can come to know in science and how to interpret it, and to go beyond what we can know based on empirical evidence using pure reason. Philosophy is then where we carry on beyond what we can claim to know empirically. And so from that perspective, philosophy is what deals with ideas like truths and proofs. Truth is a conversation for philosophers. It's beyond our reach scientifically. I believe there's an objective reality in principle.
Yeah.
But I don't believe we can claim to know what the truth of things is.
So is there anything that we can know? Like if I use in a sentence, I know X, I know, and I say not X is true, but I say I know X, would you say, oh, no, you're out of bounds. You're not allowed to say you know X.
From an epistemology perspective, I refer to a hierarchy.
Yeah.
There's belief, there's knowledge, and there's truth. Where truth would be the highest epistemic confidence we can have. Whether we can have it in principle or practice is an open question. Knowledge is something that is more certain than belief because we have reasons and evidence which we can bring to bear, which is stronger than mere opinion, mere belief.
Yeah.
And truth is the ultimate.
Right. The theoretical, absolute, final measuring stick.
Yeah, and so that's why I wear a brain of vat to suggest to you that we cannot know anything with certainty that at best we can asymptotically move towards a more likely truth, but that we may never in principle be able to get there because we cannot know demonstrably that we're not wrong, that there's not, and that's why I said Cartesian skepticism has value, because how can you truly know that the universe that you believe exists is not an illusion?
So let me role play my typical interlocutor at this point in the conversation and say, given that truth is beyond our epistemic reach, given that we cannot know with certainty, even if we agreed that there's a theoretical, objective, moral reality,
I believe there is a truth.
but we can't. But if we
principle.
are unwilling to assert that we know it, what's the functional difference? You're saying, well, in theory, there is a reality. In theory, there are moral truths. But since we can't know them with certainty, I think, tell me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like that kind of knocks you back down to relativism.
No, my argument is that I created a heuristic. I don't want to call it a philosophy because it sounds presumptuous, called probabilitarianism. So I think that what's interesting is what's probable. I think the world of the probabilistic is the world that we exist in, and that's the most interesting area of inquiry. And I think a concern for truth and a concern for certainty are aspirations that I don't find interesting. I concede that they exist, but I don't, in practice, necessarily think they're either interesting or achievable.
Wow. Okay, I feel like that given that we can't know for certain, let me just concede that our knowledge is limited and faulty. We have beliefs, but we have to acknowledge that our belief does not constitute a certain knowledge about the truth. I don't know if I'm using those words exactly right, but I'm trying to reflect
let me say it in a
back.
different way. I think we should focus our attention on the distinction between belief and knowledge.
Okay.
And I think that we should value knowledge more than belief. I think because we can bring to bear better reasons for knowledge than we can for belief, and we know how flawed belief is, and that knowledge is essentially a tentative thing.
Okay.
It's subject to change.
So it's not out of bounds to say we know something. It's just that you want people to make knowledge assertions of knowledge to be caveated with well, here's my degree of certainty I attribute to this knowledge I have.
So I think knowledge has the most value, and I think we should be careful to attribute high levels of confidence, certainty, if you want, to our knowledge claims. And then I think we should not spend much time talking about truth.
All right, so let me concede that for now.
I am very careful and try to avoid the word truth, especially truth with the capital T. If you want to talk about true in the layperson definition, as it rained in downtown Ohio yesterday at 12:30, then I'm fine with that definition of true. But if you're talking about truth with the capital T, I don't concern myself with that sort of thing.
Okay, so let me concede that for now, and I'm going to move to slide 3. I'm working backwards through my slides here. Given all these limitations and constraints and gaps and our cognitive biases, all these things that make us have to acknowledge and bake in that we aren't fully certain, right? So we can have knowledge, but it's probabilistic. I think that's to reflect that back. But given that, and given the need to act, to operationalize, to live in the world with imperfect knowledge, I think there is a dilemma. And let me put this.
Well, you're a gambler. You're a gambler.
Yes. And I think that given that we're gambling, we have to make a choice about, there's 2 different errors to my understanding. There's a type 1 error where you can believe something, but you're wrong. That's called a false positive. I believe it, and my belief is false. And then there's a type 2 error, false negatives, where you disbelieve something or you fail to believe something, but it is true, right? Like, so
And
am I,
we're more prone by evolution, the type of animal that we are,
yeah,
to succumb to type 1 errors, and because they had natural selection value.
we
Um,
believe something
we
that
we are
turns
all
out to
the
be false.
ancestors
Yeah.
of people that made more type 1 errors than type 2 errors, because type 2 errors took you out of the gene pool.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but scientific skepticism is geared deliberately or inadvertently. It is designed in such a way that it is minimizing type 1 errors. It is minimizing trying to avoid false beliefs.
Well, it's both in the sense that it is just a system for evaluating truth claims and trying to make neither type 1 nor type 2 errors. And but if you're scientifically literate, you
Yeah.
recognize we're probably more prone to type 1 errors. But you don't want to make either. You just recognize that based on what we know about the history of our species and what we know about biology, that
Yeah.
type 1 errors served us very well as hunter-gatherers 100,000 years ago, where most of the people that you were engaged in were clan. They shared your genes, they were kin, and that there were very good reasons at that time
To
to
trust
believe
them.
what you were told and to trust
Yeah.
them, and that
Yeah.
we are far more likely ancestors of people that believed. But now in the modern world, where we don't have the same level of
Hmm.
threat from the natural world, I
Yeah.
think we're more prone to the downside of credulity than we were in our more natural state, the state that is more um, contributory to the way that our brains work today. So now I
I'm
think we
tempted
have
to,
to be more
but
more
I
more
think
careful about credulity, excessive credulity.
here's why I'm intuitively, as a outsider visiting this intellectual space, I'm uneasy about that answer. I'm not fully comfortable because of the availability of evidence. I don't think that there is symmetrical availability of evidence when weighing competing claims, truth claims or knowledge, and evaluating how to weigh probabilistically how much
By the way,
weight.
Bayes' theorem is your friend.
Yeah. Well, so I'm gonna need you to elaborate on that, but let me just sort of try to paint this picture of my problem. My problem is, in particular, if you have a system of marriage, family life, extended family and community interactions. It is very, and honestly, I experienced the same thing a lot professionally as well. You would have a policy in place, and someone would be able to document all the ways that policy has failed, that has fallen short of some ideal. You would be able to quantify that. It's measurable. You can do a chart. We have this error rate on this assembly line. There's this many defects. We need to overhaul
with
this
with
assembly
some with
line.
some end goal
Yeah, right. We haven't
axiom in
optimized for
mind.
efficiency or whatever. Yeah, and they would say and be able to graph what is known, and they would use the tools of evidence to knock down the system as it exists and advocate for some overhaul of that system. But the problem is on the other side of the scales, there's no evidence. There's no data available for, like, well, if you do this change, what will the outcome be? Oh, well, we're just guessing. We don't have any evidence to show that the alternative is better, but we've used the evidence available to show that the current state has flaws. And so there seems to be an asymmetry in the availability of evidence when weighing decisions and competing claims. How do I rationally overcome or am I just wrong that asymmetry exists?
That's a good metaphor for a whole host of things. So there's a
Yeah.
trade-off. Elaborate again what you mean.
You have at your disposal in real life actual data about the current state of affairs. You don't in real life have any data about, well, we could make this change, course of action A. We could make this change, course of action B. We could make both changes, course of action C. Well, you're just guessing. And so the the weight given to the actual data versus the hypothetical data, if you're the person in the conference room saying, yeah, actually, I think that this change you're proposing will cost more. You will lose efficiencies. There are either immeasurable or you haven't taken the time to measure, or you've measured the current state, but you aren't measuring things that will be affected indirectly, second and third order effects, that there will be downsides. You can't measure those things because they haven't happened yet. And so it almost seems like the demand for evidence forces us into a situation of blundering into bad choices. I believe that your data does not comprehensively account for all the variables. How does a reasonable person who isn't a technical expert evaluate evidence and arguments in favor of a particular course of action?
Well, I mean, you're asking a very, very profound question. For anybody in the room that doesn't recognize how profound the question is, I think you didn't understand it. There's a trade-off, and this comes back to epistemology, and I think that you and I have had the conversation that I think instinct and intuition has value. So a lot of people think that as a cold empiricist, I suggest that the feelings that you can not consciously describe empirically and bring to bear with evidence have no value. I categorically reject that claim. We are built by evolution to be good problem solvers.
Right.
And part of the exercise of becoming a better critical thinker adjusts. We are very adaptive. Our intuitions then follow our experiences and our accumulation of knowledge. So a very good engineer, for example, and I'm not sure I'm getting to your point.
No, this is good.
A very good engineer who's very schooled in engineering, cause and effect, scientific reasoning, empiricism. Also, over time, his intuitions become more acutely
tuned,
calibrated to cause and effect, to how the world works.
Yeah.
And their intuitions, their judgment calls have value. Now, that's not the same thing as saying those judgment calls are right.
Yeah.
It's saying that I would have more confidence in an engineer who studied cause and effect and who understands physics very well and has a lifetime worth of experience understanding cause and effect, who has an inclination to believe that this next thing that he's going to attempt to do is good, is better, will improve something. I think that has value. I think it has intrinsic value, and that's not magical thinking. That's not wish thinking. I have experience to call that bears on this conclusion.
Right.
This is somebody who's understood and studied and practiced cause and effect. He understands it well, and he's learned things, even if he can't consciously communicate to you or prove it through an experiment.
But that becomes the challenge.
We get into really interesting stuff, because then, of course, the confabulists of this world will say, you just deferred to thinking that you can't demonstrably demonstrate is empirically
right. You don't
value
have any
added.
data. You haven't proven
right.
it. You haven't done an
and I'm saying,
experiment.
but we have something else here. We have a whole body of evidence. This is somebody who's studied cause and effect, who then his evolved adaptive intuitions have been modified by his experience in a way that I think is conducive to understanding how the universe really is. And this is we're way down the rabbit hole, my friend.
We are. That's good. Because here's what I'm going to do. Now I'm going to do a dramatic bait and switch. Now that you have conceded.
But you see how then we can cherry pick an argument.
Yeah.
And suggest that, okay, so now you're going to use the argument that because I just made that claim based on somebody who's got a ton of experience
Right,
that's
right, right, right.
relevant,
Right.
you're going to claim that Bob the blogger has just intuited quantum physics.
Yeah, I, Mr. Homemaker. I mean, my name says it all. I am an expert in homemaking. It's my niche. Yeah. So you've said things along these lines. Is that, we are the product of evolution, right? And evolution itself, our biology is a product. It has benefited from a series of trial and errors, right? It's basically a big science experiment running itself out, carrying successful DNA forward and failed DNA is left behind. But if evolutionarily, to include, so our biology and the aspects of the way we think, including our cognitive biases, are a product of evolution, which is to be relied on.
We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. The universe could be a completely different universe tomorrow. And so everything that worked every day up to today could totally fail.
Not acknowledging that, like, as you've said, tomorrow the world could be different. But insofar as the world is the same today as it was for the past 5 million years, right? Like, insofar as that is true, our biology is still serving us well. And while we can acknowledge that our cognitive biases and our heuristics can lead us into error that we should guard against, we can also acknowledge that our heuristics and instincts serve purposes, and we should not entirely be dismissive of them. Now, that's at an individual biological and the sort of cognitive level. I want to take that same thought process, and I want to take it up a level through my structuralism to the level of not the individual, but of like the family unit and of culture. And to say we need a heuristic, a way to add weight to the wisdom that we receive from our predecessors, individually and as a collective society. We have passed down traditions and principles and rules of how to, that we believe we have formulated through trial and error as a society, principles that have cultivated eudaimonia, and that we ought not dismiss those unless we have good reason to. And again, this goes back to, now I have a problem of, well, there's always data available to point out flaws in the system. There is not data available to point out how the proposed revision of the system will have flaws. So
yeah, I mean, the only thing I would add to that is that you and I would agree that those heuristics have sound reasoning behind them, that they're not just purely a function of inheritance, so that we're not making the bias of appeal to tradition, appeal to ancientness, which are also well-known biases. So very often we make the mistake of thinking something is good simply because it's done. It has always been done. Appeal to tradition, appeal to antiquity. These appeals are are common biases. So we can often argue that simply because something has been done for a long time, it is good. So I think where you and I would agree is that let's presume for the moment that these things have resulted in good outcomes. So we're presuming that these heuristics have demonstrated their validity. But it is important to have the conversation that it's important to make sure that we can demonstrate the validity and value of those heuristics. If you're just simply appealing to it, that's not a good reason to believe something.
So
right?
when you say
agree with
appeal
that, right?
to, well, I'm not so sure. I think we need to flesh this out a little bit. I think that Pinker's argument is, like, by default dismissive of received wisdom that is passed down through tradition, and almost hostile to, is to say, it's not, unlike what you were saying of, the engineer on the assembly line who has this calibrated wisdom, we need to give that some weight alongside our data. Well, I would try to, again, elevate that to, well, we should apply that same principle to cultural tradition that has been calibrated. That should be given some weight alongside the data. But I think Pinker would reject that. I think you'd say, no, that has no value.
Well, I might suggest that the way you described it might be a false dichotomy.
Probably.
In the sense that I wouldn't say that inherited wisdom, passed down knowledge has no value. I would say that we are reasonable to always question inherited wisdom.
Okay.
So from a critical thinking perspective, we should always question everything and demand that it meet its burden of proof.
That's all the time we have for today. When Scientific Skeptic and I continue our conversation, we will dive into the substantive issues of marriage and divorce, family function and dysfunction, how we evaluate that, and how we foster the ways of life most conducive to human flourishing. Until next time, happy homemaking.
Thank you so much for attending today's discussion with Mr. Homemaker. Please take this opportunity to subscribe, like, and share this episode with your spouse, relatives, and friends. We further invite you to access complimentary information and resources at our website, mr-homemaker.com. There you will also find links to join the discussion via email or social media. And please, support the Mr. Homemaker podcast and receive merchandise and membership benefits on patreon.com. Until next time, farewell.